Ladies and gentlemen, so this is the third evening on the lectures on truth, and I believe today it's the most delicate thing, truth and feelings. I could imagine that a lot can be said about that, and so we look forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much. Oh yes, that's working, I think. Good. Yes, I want today to finish by talking about the difference that some of the themes I've been talking about, particularly deflationism, which I'm going to remind you about, the impact they've had on really a set of controversies that went on throughout the 20th century. And those are about the status of moral judgments or normative judgments in general, judgments which have an element of ought in them. They could be judgments about what you ought to do, or about what ought to be the case, or perhaps just about what's better than another thing, what's to be preferred, and so on. These are judgments which are often supposed to express feelings. On the other hand, they have the appearance of commitments which are true or false. And in the 20th century, I think it's fair to say there were three different schools of philosophy. Well, perhaps four, but one of them I'm not really going to talk about. In 1903, G. Moore published his famous book, Principia Ethica, which became a kind of Bible for the Bloomsbury group in London, people like Virginia Woolf and E.M. Forster, Maynard Keynes, and so on. And one of the things that Moore was keen to show was that normative judgments, judgments of feeling, as I'm going to call them, were not simply about the empirical data on which they might nevertheless be based. So, for example, if you're a utilitarian, you've got a certain standard for one situation being better than another. One situation would be better than another if it promoted human happiness to a greater extent than the other. So if you're choosing between two future possibilities, you do a kind of cost-benefit analysis, and if one choice led to a better situation by that standard, then that was the one to be chosen. But the standard itself, Moore argued, would always be open to doubt. It would always be, as it were, synthetic, a substantive proposition that the situation which maximizes happiness is the one that's to be preferred. And you can see that it's debatable because, in fact, a lot of people don't believe it. A lot of people would challenge that. They say that sometimes there are other values in place than sheer maximization of human happiness. For example, you might worry that the distribution of happiness matters, and so an issue of justice might arise, whereby the most happiness is produced by some kind of unjust distribution of goods and benefits and costs and so on, and then the just situation would be something slightly different, and that would be the better one. Well, you could to and fro about this, you can argue about it, people can bring up things like the diminishing marginal utility of money and so on to try and show that utilitarianism would be on the side of justice. And you can to and fro about this. But the point is you're to and froing about something substantive. And Moore insisted on that. He insisted that no amount of semantic juggling, no amount of definition, or no amount of a priori reasoning would give you the answer to questions like that. So the idea is that the relationship between a standard in virtue of which you appreciate things and the appreciation itself is there's a link there which is not a link which is formed by the meaning of words or formed by logical deduction. It's a matter of, well, let's say intuition, which is what Moore christened it as. Well, I think most 20th century writers, not all, but most, accepted Moore's argument. They said, yes, that's absolutely right. And then three different schools developed. The first school we can call Normative Realists. They said, right, well, good old G. Moore, he's given us a marker here. He's given us a desideratum, something that we must respect. So what we have to say is that normative judgments concern a special layer of normative fact, which we know about by some means like intuition, and they're true or false according to whether they correspond with the normative facts. So you can see there's a kind of correspondence theory creeping in the background. So that was moral realism or normative realism. In opposition to that, more kind of empirically minded philosophers said, well, the metaphysical costs of that are just too great to bear. We can't be doing with an extra layer of reality, the ought layer, as it were, the normative layer, and truth or falsity concerning that. We don't know how we know about it. Intuition is not a theory, it just christens the problem. We don't know why we're interested in it. Why should we bother? Haven't we got enough on our plate worrying about the empirical world and the facts about human happiness? Why should we also worry about these oughts and how they distribute themselves? So more hard-nosed empiricist philosophers, and particularly the philosophers of the logical positivist school, said, no, we've got to think about this entirely different. And what we've got to realize here is that we're in the domain of feeling, we're in a practical domain, a domain of preference, a domain in which we argue for and against policies. We're not talking about facts. We'll adduce facts as reasons for policies, certainly. But that's okay by more, that's fine, that's what we're doing. But what we're doing is not so much discovering a new layer of truth, new kinds of facts. We're arguing for practical policies. I'm against something, you're for it, we're at loggerheads, we have to argue it out and try to establish our own preference. And then finally, there was a third ism, which is commonly known as an error theory. This was associated with the philosopher John Mackey in Oxford, who wrote in the 1970s a book called Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. And Mackey said, well, the realists were right about the appearances. Expressivism is a little bit radical. It's got some difficulty doing justice to the actual linguistic data, the way we talk about rights and wrongs. We talk as if they're moral facts. And Mackey said we ought to respect that. But of course, since there aren't any, here he agreed with the expressivists, since there aren't any, we're just in error when we talk about what ought to be done or what's right to do or what's your duty. We're making appeal to a layer of fact which just doesn't exist. So it's a bit like invoking a god. You might invoke God as being on your side, but those of us who are agnostics or atheists will worry that you're not doing really anything. You're in error about what there is, and so you're making an erroneous claim, a claim that's mistaken. So Mackey promoted what he called an error theory. And the ding-dong in the 20th century was largely between those three views. There were people who tried to reject More's view. They were called naturalists. They said that the layer of fact which makes true ought judgments is just the ordinary layer of empirical fact. But most people took More's argument to have refuted that. So the three that were, I think, big players were moral realism, expressivism, and error theory. And for most of the 20th century, people thought they knew the pros and cons of those three different positions. But gradually, as I've been describing in the first two lectures, confidence in things like truth and representation started to unravel. And so we got deflationism. And just to remind you about deflationism, that's the view A, that there's a complete cognitive equivalence between it's true that P and P. B, that conforming to that equivalence is all that's required to manifest a complete understanding of the truth predicate, of the predicate claiming that some proposition is true. And the utility of the predicate is logical. It is a device for indirect reference and generalization. And I talked about that a certain amount last night, so I'm not going to go over that in any detail again. But the point about deflationism is that when you say that a proposition is true, you're not talking about it. You're simply endorsing it. Now, this makes a big difference to the moral debate because take the realists. The realists liked saying things like, a moral remark might be, let's take a moral remark. You ought to look after your children. Parents ought to look after their children, okay? It's a fairly unambitious moral remark. Philosophers always like unambitious examples. You ought not to stamp on babies for fun. Okay. Right, so we all agree with that. The realists said, well, you see, I think there's a layer of truth here. There's a truth that you ought not to stamp on babies for fun. I think there's a fact. It's a strange sort of fact. I don't quite know what sort of fact it is, but it's a strange sort of fact. And the remark is true because it conforms to that fact. Well, that's using very correspondence kind of theorizing about truth. If we substitute deflationism, we'll find that the realist is just really banging the table and repeating himself. Because what he's saying is it's wrong to stamp on babies for fun. It's true that it's wrong to stamp on babies for fun. It's a fact that it's wrong to stamp on babies for fun, and so on. And the deflationist tells us that that's going nowhere. That's simply reiterating that it's wrong to stamp on babies for fun. So the realism isn't a meta-theory. It's not a theory about the proposition. It turns out just to be a way of restating it. And you're only going to disagree with that if you're some sort of moral monster and you think it's okay to stamp on babies for fun. And not many people are going to take that view. So if we think seriously of the deflationism as the view that was introduced by Frege, it is really by using the form of an assertoric sentence that we assert truth, and to do this, we do not need to use the word true. That's in his logic. What logic is really concerned with is not contained in the word true at all, but in the assertoric force with which a sentence is uttered. And that's a slightly more complicated remark of Frege's, which I'm not going to discuss. But if we take Frege's deflationism, which gradually grew traction, it grew more and more attractive to philosophers throughout the 20th century, you suddenly start losing the meta-ethical debate, because realism is no longer identifiable as an ism. It's just a way of sort of banging the table and insisting on it being wrong to stamp on babies for fun. And if you don't think that, you're some kind of moral monster. It's not that you've got a specifically sophisticated philosophical view. You've just got a terrible way of feeling about the world. So the debate in meta-ethics, in the theory of ethics, started to crumble. And a lot of people worried that this was going to be the end of it. Well, they didn't worry about it, except that philosophers worry about talking themselves out of a job. But it seemed as though the old battle lines were no longer capable of being drawn where they had been drawn. Well, or is that too quick? Well, one obstacle stood in the way, but it was a big obstacle, and this was the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein knew Frege. He knew him personally, actually, and he certainly knew Frege's work on truth, and indeed he echoed it. Wittgenstein was a deflationist about truth, so that's fine. But Wittgenstein was also a functional pluralist. That is, he thought that lots of different bits of language had different roles. Language wasn't a kind of smooth, uniform instrument for describing the world. There were lots of differences within language. The previous slide, I think yes, he says here, the basic evil of Russell's logic, and also of mine in the Tractatus, is that what a proposition is illustrated by a few commonplace examples and then presupposed as understood in full generality. And in connection with that, he says, I'll teach you differences. And a metaphor that he uses, which I very much like, and this is right at the beginning of his major posthumous book, The Philosophical Investigations, is the metaphor of the cabin of the locomotive. He thinks that looking at language is like looking into the cabin of a locomotive, we see handles all looking more or less alike, naturally, since they're all supposed to be handled. But one is the handle of a crank, which can be moved continuously. It regulates the opening of a valve. Another is the handle of a switch, which has only two effective positions. It's either off or on. A third is the handle of a brake lever. The harder you pull on it, the harder it brakes. A fourth is the handle of a pump. It has an effect only as long as it's moved to and fro. When we say every word in language signifies something, we have so far said nothing whatever. And that ties in with what I was talking to you about yesterday about Sellar's dot notation. It's a pithy way of putting the moral of that. So here we've got Wittgenstein insisting on functional pluralities, different things you can do with language, and yet at the same time, he's got this deflationist attitude to truth. And if you've got a deflationist attitude to truth, you've got a deflationist attitude to things like describes and represents and fact. So what examples does Wittgenstein give of this kind of functional plurality, these differences of function? Well, almost everywhere he treats anything, this is the tool that he brings to bear. He talks about mathematics, he talks about claims of necessity, he talks about bedrock propositions, propositions which somehow aren't empirical because they're the metaphor is they form the riverbed within which your empirical knowledge flows. So he talked about propositions like motor cars do not grow on trees. And he thought that a proposition like that, you couldn't go in for an empirical investigation that tests whether it's true, because what would you rely on? If you're so far out to lunch that you don't know that motor cars don't grow on trees, then what else would you be capable of relying on? And so any investigation you made of it would be some kind of sham. It would have to be a sort of Alice in Wonderland investigation. And Wittgenstein thought that meant that the function of those propositions was importantly different from the function of propositions that simply served as descriptions of empirical fact. There's a doctrine of avowals, which I'm not going to talk about, but it's to do with psychology. Ethics and religious sayings. Wittgenstein is famous for the kind of anti-ontological construction of religion. He very much thought that religious sayings, he had a very strong religious streak himself, and he thought that religious sayings didn't really function as descriptions of the world. They were more like expressions of an attitude towards the world. The religious language game was to be thought of as a very different kind of object from ordinary empirical descriptions. If you think of the way David Hume or even Immanuel Kant thought about theology, they thought about religious descriptions of, God sent his son to the world, that sort of thing, as describing a part of reality, only a supernatural part of reality, something that somehow lay beyond our unaided sense experience and perhaps even beyond our theoretical grasp, defied understanding. But nevertheless, we were talking about something that it was important, very, very important to say that it existed and that it had various properties. And Wittgenstein thought that was wrong. When you go in for religious language, you're not attempting to describe a rather weird part of reality. You're attempting to give voice to feelings about the world. So, for example, a more adequate expression of a religious spirit might be the music of Bach or other church music. A more adequate expression might be kind of various kinds of rituals, perhaps including things like prayer. But you hadn't got to think of prayer as a kind of conversation with somebody who's missing. You had to think of prayer as something that you're, as it were, communing with your own soul. So Wittgenstein's famous for that kind of difference in the functional account of what you're doing if you go in for religious sayings. So ethics, religion, that all in all of these areas, he seizes for the idea of a different function. So I'm just going to give you the flavor of some of the things he says. In connection with mathematics, he says, why do you want always to consider mathematics under the aspect of discovering and not of doing? It must influence us a great deal that in calculating we use the words correct and true and false in the form of statements, shaking and nodding one's head. But then there's no doubt at all that in certain language games, mathematical propositions play the part of rules of description as opposed to descriptive propositions. So again, you're not describing the odd world of numbers. You're doing something else. You're laying down rules of inference, actually. That is not to say that this contrast does not shade off in all directions, and that, in turn, is not to say that the contrast is not of the greatest importance. That's from his work, The Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics. And then he says things like this, which this is one I rather like, from his philosophical remarks, the Zettel. We say, if you really follow the rule in multiplying, it must come out the same. Now, when this is merely the slightly hysterical style of university talk, we have no need to be particularly interested. It is, however, the expression of an attitude towards the technique of multiplying, which comes out everywhere in our lives. The emphasis of the must corresponds only to the inexorability of this attitude, not merely towards the technique of calculating, but also towards innumerable related practices. So here you've got a direct contrast between offering a description of the world and expressing an attitude. And he thinks that when you go in for modal talk, you say that things must be thus and so. 7 plus 5 must be 12, 3 times 4 must be 12, and so on. You are expressing an attitude rather than coming out with a description. So if we rely on Wittgenstein, it looks as though we should be able to be deflationists, but still have the division between, say, an expressive attitude to moral, ethical, or normative statements and a realist attitude. A realist says these things are describing their own coordinate part of the world. The expressivist says, no, they're expressing an attitude. And here in this functional pluralism, we see Wittgenstein as adopting exactly that contrast and saying it's of the greatest importance. So the question is, how then are these debates to be conducted? How is an expressivist to differentiate himself from a realist? Remember, each of them is going to say, it's wrong to stamp on babies for fun. The expressivist is going to say that's the expression of an attitude or feeling about a certain way of behaving in the world. The realist is going to say it describes a normative proposition. But then sheltering behind deflationism, what else would it be doing? It's true if and only if it's wrong to stamp on blind babies for fun. Did I say blind babies? It's wrong to stamp on any baby for fun. Okay. I was just exaggerating. Okay, so how is the debate to be conducted? How are we to, as it were, find a diagnostic for whether Wittgenstein's account of these things in terms of attitude is a good thing or not? About ethics, he himself says in 1929, you imagine the book of the world. It contains all relative judgments of value and all true scientific propositions, and in fact, all true propositions that can be made. By relative, he meant judgments of value like good tennis player, which he thought were actually just simply, there's simple criteria, and there's no difference between saying somebody's a good tennis player and saying that he's the kind of tennis player who can win matches. So those aren't very important. But even if we make sure that our book describes all human feelings, there will simply be facts, facts, and facts, but no ethics. Ethics, if it is anything, is supernatural, and our words will only express facts. As a teacup will only hold a teacup full of water, and if I were to pour out a gallon over it. You can see why Wittgenstein's such a great writer, incidentally. So here, you know, deflationism isn't invited to this because there are no ethical facts. Well, what about the fact that it's wrong to stamp on babies for fun? Why isn't that there in the book of the world? And here's Wittgenstein saying it's something else. It's something else. So Someone might say there is still the difference between truth and falsity. Any ethical judgment in whatever system may be true or false. Remember that P is true means simply P, deflationism. If I say, although I believe that so-and-so is good, I may be wrong, this says no more than that what I assert may be denied. Or suppose someone says, one of the ethical systems must be the right one, or nearer the right one. Well, suppose I say Christian ethics is the right one. Then I am making a judgment of value. It amounts to adopting Christian ethics. It is not like saying that one of these physical theories must be the right one. The way in which some reality corresponds or conflicts with a physical theory has no counterpart here. Well, I mean, I think, you know, the simplest diagnosis is that Wittgenstein was simply confused. And that's not impossible. But it's quite clear that he's tormenting himself, as it were, with the idea that the deflationist theory of truth rules everywhere, which he sometimes says. But then he thinks that in the case of physical theory, there's something that amounts to correspondence with the world, which is missing in the case of ethics. And you'd only say that if you were half in bed with something like an old-fashioned correspondence theory of truth. And we saw some of the arguments against that in both of the last two lectures. And Wittgenstein was well aware of those arguments. Or we have to find a reconstruction of what he says. And I don't think that at present in the literature there's a very satisfactory defense of him over all these apparently conflicting views that he's trying to hold together. But I'm inclined to try and give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm inclined to say that there's something right in the way he's thinking about this. I don't really like the introduction of the word correspondence in that last quotation, but I think we can do something to ratify his judgment. Or in other words, we can say that in spite of the arrival of deflationism on the scene, there was something to the combat between expressivist theories, realist theories, and error theories in the case of ethics. We shouldn't lose sight of the different motivations that underlie those judgments. Well, how am I going to try and pull this off? How am I going to try to say there's a defense of Wittgenstein possible? Well, I'm going to introduce an older philosopher. This is Charles Sanders Peirce, and something that Peirce laid down as a kind of methodological principle for doing philosophy is there. We must not begin by talking of pure ideas, vagabond thoughts that tramp the public highways without human habitation, but with men and their conversation. And I think what Peirce was emphasizing there is that if you start with abstract terms like truth, normativity, representation, description, these are vagabond terms that tramp the public highways with no human habitation, unless you actually rub your nose in what we do with them. How do we actually use them? What use do people make of them? And of course, one of the uses we might make of them is in connection with things like inquiry, trying to find the truth. We might ask, for example, about the difference between ethical inquiry, what happens when we worry genuinely about whether our moral views are the right ones. What do we do as we inquire about that? And the contrast, if there is one, between ethical inquiry and physical inquiry. So perhaps we can do something to rehabilitate the distinction between ethics and physics, even if the clothing of language makes everything look alike. It looks as though we've just got propositions in each case, and they're equally true or false, and they're equally facts in each case. Even though that sort of uniformity is spread over things, perhaps there's room for diversity, and something of Wittgenstein's functional diversity will come out if we actually look at the way we use these terms in our inquiries and in our other practices. Well, I'm going to try and make that good in connection with the idea of truth in feeling. Feelings are not entirely straightforward. here's the philosopher Gilbert Ryle. He's opposing a view. Actually, the view he's opposing is represented by this lady, who I think some of you may remember. Martha Nussbaum held in a book that she wrote in 2005 that emotions, she was wondering what sort of thing emotions are. And she convinced herself that emotions are appraisals or value judgments, which ascribe to things and persons outside the person's own control great importance for that person's own flourishing. And she tried to defend that view. It's a very improbable view, I think. But she tried to defend it by saying that otherwise you'd have to think of emotions as twinges or jabs, unintelligent, impulsive, and thoughtless. Things that just assailed you, as it were, like a sudden twinge in your finger or a jab of pain in a tooth. And she thought emotions weren't like that. I think she's right that they're nothing like that. But she jumped from that to thinking, well, then they're just a kind of judgment, and particularly a judgment about things which are outside your own control, but which hold great importance for your own flourishing. I mean, that last bit seems wrong on the face of it. If you think of compassion, which I think is an emotion, you're upset at somebody's disaster, some pain, your child is in pain, you're upset because of that, that's an emotional feeling. It's very odd to think that you're upset because as it were, of something about yourself. On the face of it, you're upset because of something about your child. It's not a self-centered and egoistic feeling. It's a feeling which has an object, and the object is your child's being unwell or being in pain or whatever it is, your child's distress. It might just be another person's distress. It doesn't have to be your child. But being in contact with or being next to somebody else who's in distress, for most people, is distressing. They feel an emotion. But they're not worried about their own well-being. If I see you're coming in holding a mouth. This is sort of a bit twitchy. Can we turn it down a bit or something? I'll put it a bit further down. Oh, I see. It's rubbing on my jacket. See if that's better. If I see you coming in with your, holding your hand over your mouth because you've got a terrible toothache, and I go, oh dear, I'm so sorry for you. I'm not worried about myself getting toothache. I know it's not catching. It's not a contagious disease, toothache. So it's not something of importance to my own flourishing that's bothering me. So that seems wrong. But it also seems wrong to think of an emotion as just a judgment, because a judgment can be quite clinical. I could judge that somebody's in distress but not feel anything about it. It might be a matter of indifference to me if for some reason my sympathies are cut off. But I could still judge that they're in distress. If you suppose you say that today's meeting on environmental policy was too emotional to get anywhere. You don't mean that people made too many judgments about environmental policy. You mean that they got hot under the collar, started thumping the table and shouting at each other, all that. That's what made the meeting too emotional to get anywhere. So really, I think Nussbaum's own theory, I think, is very implausible. But what really bothers me here is that she thinks those are the two alternatives. And I think that's wrong. And one way of seeing that it's wrong is to look at what Ryle said. Ryle talked about things like feeling that there's a flaw in your argument. He thought that feeling that there's a flaw in your argument isn't so much judging that there's a flaw in your argument as being tempted to judge it. Just getting that kind of discomfort about the way you're arguing, which is very familiar to philosophers, when we think, oh, hang on, something's going wrong here, I think, let's just go over that one more time, and so on and so on. No special sensation is had when I feel that there's a flaw in your argument. The question's, where do you feel it? Would an aspirin allay it? Have you got it now? Does it come and go, or is it there all the time? Are not pertinent questions. My feeling that there's a flaw in your argument can be strong, but not intense or acute, continuous or intermittent. I am in no distress. I just feel there's something wrong about your argument. So feelings, Ryle is agreeing with Nussbaum to the extent of seeing that feelings are not pure sensations. They're not jabs and twitches and twinges, of which you can ask, are they intermittent? When do they start? Have they got more intense or acute, or is it dying away, and so on? They're not things like that. They're more to do with thought, but they're also to do with responses, your responsiveness, your feeling in a practical or it has a practical manifestation, your feeling. If I feel there's a flaw in your argument, I'm reluctant to accept it. I want to go over it one more time. I'm going to need convincing of one of the premises, or whatever it might be. So there's a disturbance. I'm disturbed about it. I'm not just going to fly into accepting it. Okay, well, with feelings placed as relatively complex things, what about the kind of feelings about which we might talk about truth or falsity? And the obvious examples are feelings in morals, but let's start with the harder case of feelings in aesthetics, your feelings about paintings or pieces of music. And if we're talking about that, the natural place to start, I suppose, is Immanuel Kant. The third critique is the critique of judgment, and it's all about aesthetics. And Kant said, amongst other things, this: many things, for him, for some subject, possess charm and agreeableness. No one cares about that. But when somebody, a person, puts a thing on a pedestal and calls it beautiful, he demands the same delight from others. He judges not merely for himself, but for all men. And then, oh dear, this is terrible, isn't it? It's coming round and hitting my shirt. I wonder if we can, I think that may have fixed it. I've got it out of the way of my shirt. Yes, I think it was.
If you put it up here,
maybe that would be better. Yeah. Sorry about this. Oh, wait, there. No?
It doesn't touch this.
Yeah.
Can I?
No, it's when it touches the shirt, I think.
Have a soft shirt.
Yeah, I got a soft shirt. I tell you what, let's get this back. See if there's less wiggle on it now. No. Oh, wait a minute. How's that? Oh. Maybe I could just hold it. I'll just hold it. Yeah. Simple solution. Okay, many things for him may possess charm and agreeableness. No one cares about that. But when he puts a thing on a pedestal and calls it beautiful, he demands the same delight from others. He judges not merely for himself, but for all men, and then speaks of beauty as if it were a property of things. He demands this agreement of others. He blames them if they judge differently, and denies them taste, which he still requires of them as something they ought to have. So Kant is here talking about, as it were, the appearance of objectivity in our judgments of beauty. He contrasts it with judgments of charm and agreeableness. He also contrasts them with judges of the palate and other things like that. Whether a dress, a house, or a flower is beautiful is a matter upon which one declines to allow one's judgment to be swayed by any reasons or principles. We want to get a look at the object with our own eyes, just as if our delight depended on sensation. And yet, if upon so doing we call the object beautiful, we believe ourselves to be speaking with a universal voice and lay claim to the concurrence of everyone, whereas no private sensation would be decisive, except for the observer alone and his liking. Well, Kant is here rediscovering something that Hume talked about in a great essay Hume wrote called Of the Standard of Taste, easily available online and very well worth reading. And Hume started his essay by saying, you know, it's practically a platitude that everybody's got their own taste, there's no arguing about taste, de gustibus non est disputandum. you know, it's pointless, maybe tastes are relative, different upbringing, different culture, you find different things attractive. We don't argue about it, we shouldn't. That's one side of the dilemma, but then, of course, we do argue about it. And Hume says, and if your judgment of taste was sufficiently out of kilter, people would think there was something wrong with you. He gives the example of a practically unknown writer called Ogilby of the Stuart times, the 17th century, and says, you know, if somebody thought that there was no difference in merit between Milton and Ogilby, they'd be completely out to lunch, they'd be completely wrong. So in fact, in practice, we allow that there are better or worse judgments of taste. Now, Hume doesn't go as far as Kant. Kant says we demand agreement from others. I actually think that's too strong for reasons I'll come to. But Kant's right about something, and that's the same thing that Hume's pointing to, which is that in our practices, remembering Peirce's dictum, we're not talking about aesthetic truth in the abstract as a vagabond idea that tramps the public highways with no human habitation. We're talking about the actual practices of criticism. What goes on when people do argue about taste, do try to convince somebody who's perhaps got cloth ears or cloth eyes that they're wrong. They're wrong not to see features which go towards making something attractive. Kant's own attempt to resolve this dilemma, this antinomy, he called it, on the one hand, de gustibus non est disputandum, on the other hand, we don't behave like that. His own view I'm not going to talk about, but what I'll do is give you an example of aesthetic judgment in practice. So here is, here's a writer. I don't know if anybody of you can guess who this is. I had really been enjoying the good old city of Florence, but I now learned from Mr. Ruskin that this was a scandalous waste of charity. I should have gone about with an imprecation on my lips. I should have worn a face 3 yards long. Ruskin loved Gothic architecture, and he thought that the rot fell in the cities like Florence when, with the arrival of the Renaissance, architecture took on a certain kind of grandeur and dignity, instead of, as it were, being devoted to the glory of God. You know, Gothic choirs looking upwards to God, kind of carrying you out of yourself. The architecture expressed a certain kind of complacency, he thought, or even pride, which is even worse, you know. Pride is the radix omnia malorum, the root of all evil. So Ruskin, being a good Christian, thought that was terrible. So here is the writer in question is Henry James, and that's a picture of him on the left. James goes on to talk about Ruskin. So Ruskin gave an aesthetic critique of Florence. And that's why he was telling James he should go about with an imprecation on his lips, swearing at things, and with a face 3 yards long. And James says, nothing is in fact more comical than the familiar asperity of the author's style and the pedagogic fashion in which he pushes and pulls his unhappy pupils about, jerking their heads towards this, rapping their knuckles for that, sending them to stand in corners and giving them scripture text to copy. He says, there can be no greater want of tact in dealing with those things with which men attempt to ornament life than to be perpetually talking about error. A truce to all rigidities is the law of the place. The only thing that is absolute there is sensible charm. The grim old bearer of the scales is not invited. She excuses herself. She feels that this is not her province. Differences here are not iniquity and righteousness. They're simply variations of temperament and point of view. We are not under theological government. So there's James pushing back against Ruskin trying to tell him that he shouldn't appreciate the city of Florence and its architecture. And we're all, I think most of us would be on James's side here. Ruskin's a very acute critic. He's very well worth reading, but some of his judgments seem to us very strange. Well, you might think that this means that James is going to be on the De Gustibus side, but that's not true. Henry James wrote more criticism than he wrote novels. He wrote a lot of novels. He's, from the beginning of his career, about the middle, just before the middle of the 19th century, well into the 20th century, he occupied himself writing critiques, writing aesthetic criticism, criticism of painting, criticism of literature especially, other writers, criticism of critics. He was constantly involved with the attempt to get it right, to give just appreciation. So although he says the grim old figure of the scales, that's the figure of justice, is not invited, he actually thought there was such a thing as getting at the correct aesthetic response, the true feeling that a work deserved to engender in people. But it took work. So he sees himself as the student, the inquirer, the observer, the interpreter, the active, indefatigable commentator, whose constant aim was to arrive at justness of characterization. And he says, criticism is the gateway to appreciation, and appreciation is the gateway to enjoyment. So James is in effect introducing a cognitive element into what might seem like a pure question of feeling, and therefore something about which de gustibus, etc., non est disputandum. Because he thinks there is such a thing as interpreting a work correctly, as bringing out its good and bad points, showing people things that they mightn't have noticed for themselves. And he's obviously right. Hume, in the essay I mentioned, The Standard of Taste, gives a lovely example of a way in which this could be right. And it's an example of increased discrimination, extra discrimination, which a critic may have, and which then shows you that he or she is somebody worth listening to. And the story is of one of Sancho, it's from Cervantes, and Sancho Panza tells Don Quixote that he comes from a family of very, very delicate and discriminating wine tasters. So he knows his wine. And to show this, to prove it, he talks of an episode where two of his ancestors, I think an uncle and his brother, were faced with a new hogshead of wine. Hogshead is a very, very large quantity of wine. It's 54 gallons, which is probably about 220 litres or something like that. So it's a very large quantity of wine. They're faced with this great big barrel of wine, and they're asked their opinion of the wine. And one of them tastes it, and he says, it's very good wine, it's excellent wine. It's a pity that it's spoiled by that just slight sort of metallic taste, sort of almost iron sort of taste. But otherwise it's very good. And the other brother tastes it and says, yes, it's very good indeed, but it's spoiled, isn't it, by just that little bit of sort of leathery tang. And everyone laughs at them. Nobody else can taste anything at all wrong with it or distinctive about it. And eventually, in time, the hogshead is drunk, and when they get to the bottom, they find a key there, an iron key with a leather key tab in it. So right at the bottom there's this, which shows, as it were, proves that these two weren't hallucinating, or they weren't making it up, or they weren't just shooting a line. They had actually discriminated something which other people would miss. And so one of the things that obviously a critic might hope to do is bring out features of works, for good or bad, that other people might miss. And that's why James calls himself the student, the inquirer, the observer, the interpreter, the active, indefatigable commentator. It's not just a question of swapping feelings. In fact, it's not at all really a question of swapping anything like sensations. You might or might not enjoy a work. It may be that listening to Henry James on something you lose your enjoyment of it because he's pointed out something which actually affects the work for the worst. It means that it's, for example, sentimental or cheap or boring or in some other way less good than you took it to be. It's not a question, therefore, simply of upping your enjoyment, Although there will be a respect in which you've listened to a good critic, in which you do up your enjoyment, because you learn something. Sancho Panza's uncles could teach people something about wine tasting. Whether they actually learnt it is another matter, but they were at any rate in a position to learn it. And John Stuart Mill said, of course, very famously, no intelligent human being would consent to be a fool, no instructed person would be an ignoramus, no person of feeling and conscience would be selfish and base, even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his lot than they are with theirs. This is the famous, better Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And I think what's right about Mill's saying there is that it's very rare, in fact I think it's almost unknown, for people to regret a genuine increase in understanding. When you've achieved a position of greater understanding, you can't look back on your innocent self with envy. You look back perhaps with some embarrassment. And I think, well, I don't say you can't, but it's very unusual, I think. The Romantics tried it. They tried to sort of valorize and celebrate childhood. Childish innocence was kind of a state in which you were nearer to God than when you became an adult. But it's not very convincing. If all the child can do is babble, you're glad of having learnt language. So what you get here is the practice of criticism, and this is the practice of trying to introduce people to more aesthetic truths, more truths about how to feel about things, is a genuine practice. It's something that critics can help you with. If you come to a new art form and you don't understand anything about it, you've got cloth eyes, as it were, it may be the fault of the art form. It may be that it's not much good. There's not much to say about it in its favor. But very often it's not that. It's because you haven't appreciated and learned what it is that can be said about it in its favor. You don't appreciate what the artist is trying to do. If if it's a work of music, you don't hear the melody, you don't hear the counterpoint, you don't hear the fugue, you don't understand what's going on. And it takes perhaps the good critic to help you to do that, and experience, which enables you to discriminate the good from the bad. And those exercises are ones which, as John Stuart Mill says, they increase your understanding, and you wouldn't be content to be without them once you've gone through them. So what you've got here is a story about what aesthetic inquiry can be and what it can amount to. And truth is just what you get more of as you go through these inquiries. So aesthetic truth even has a role to play. It's something like a focus imaginarius in optics, the imaginary point at the end of a focus, the imaginary ideal point that you would be seeking for, you'd be trying to approach. And of course you may be doubtful about whether you're ever going to arrive at such a position. Peirce, again, once described truth as the opinion that is fated to be agreed upon by all who inquire. I don't think he presented that as a definition. Peirce didn't like definitions of abstract concepts, as we've seen. He thought that was the wrong place to go. But what he was doing was trying to get you not to focus on the idea of aesthetic truth as an abstract and possibly rather worrying concept, but to remind yourself of the actual procedures which you will call ones of inquiry and ones which can get you nearer to a just characterization of a work of art or something that you're listening to. So it seems to me that the way in which we might think about Wittgenstein, to go back to the problem of how we keep the debate between expressivist error theorists and realists going in the face of deflation, would be something like this. We'd say, look, let's accept that in areas such as the normative, or the aesthetic, we're talking about feeling. How are we to feel about stamping on babies for fun? We're going to feel against it, I hope. We're going to feel revulsion at the very idea. We're going to feel horror at anybody who'd dream of doing such a thing. So this is how we're going to feel. Why do we think that that feeling's true or right or correct? Well, because we'd be very anxious to lead anybody who'd failed to feel the same way to it by showing them, as we think, more about the situation, more about what it's like to be a baby that's stamped on, more about what it's like to be somebody who takes pleasure in the pains of other people. Those are bad things. If somebody can't see outright that they're bad things, they need help. And we'd call that, giving that help, getting nearer to the normative truth. And eventually you might think that something's done and dusted, that we have arrived at the end point where all who inquire, or all that we're going to be conversable with who inquire, will agree. That's why we take examples which are very, very certain. When it comes to something like the value of the architecture of Florence, it's not very likely that Henry James and Ruskin are going to agree. Maybe that they have to agree to differ, which in the case of aesthetics we can do. In the case of the normative, it's not quite so easy to do because normative policies are immediately refracted in things like laws, forbidding things and permitting things. And if you're in favor of forbidding something and I'm in favor of permitting it, we can't just agree to differ because we're going to fight for different practical policies. So aesthetics is slightly less fraught, slightly less immediate practical importance than contradictory judgments in the case of ethics. But even in aesthetics, as I've tried to show you, you can have a role for inquiry and you can have a role for the idea of truth. But it doesn't stop ethics being a matter, or aesthetics being a matter of feeling. I think we remain, I think, on all fours with the expressivist. We remain on all fours with Wittgenstein's functional plurality. We've got something else to think about in the case of aesthetics and ethics. So it seems to me that we can, by sufficiently rubbing our nose into the actual procedures that we have, we can come to appreciate both the value of deflationism and largely the value of Wittgenstein's functional pluralism. But it's quite difficult to hold those forces together. They seem to pull apart, and many contemporary philosophers think they do pull apart. But I'd like you to try and get into the habit of trying to do justice to both pulls. It may be a case where it's virtuous to be of two minds, and I don't mind that either. Well, it looks as though my hour is getting to be up. Let me just check that that didn't start very much earlier than I expected. No, we're getting up to 20:30, so I think I ought to stop and offer people time for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks again for these words and remarks, and yes, the session is open for questions or comments. I may have one myself, actually, to start. As you may know, in many of these new research applications, particularly in medicine and life science, it's not only the scientific merits which are judged, but also always an ethics commission or committee has to look at it. So what would be their benchmarks, so to speak?
Right. I think, I mean, one benchmark which I think ethics committees are very keen on would be given by Kant. That is Kant said you must never treat a human being as a mere means, but also as an end. And the idea there is that you're not allowed to deceive people, you're not allowed to manipulate them, you're not allowed, as it were, to treat them in a way which bypasses their own feelings about how they ought to be treated. If you lie to somebody, you, as it were, bypass their capacity to reason about the situation because you try and impose a false judgment upon them. It's very controversial exactly what Kant meant by that and quite how he defended it, but it gives an ethics commission, I think, a certain kind of lifeline, something to cling on to, because at least one thing that an experimenter shouldn't do is to deceive people about what situation they're in. That is, not to take them into his confidence or actually tell them something false. And a lot of experimental work in psychology and in medicine in the early 20th century did exactly that. It lied to people, and sometimes with terrible consequences. There were things like giving people false test reports. So they take some test. Can you distinguish true from false suicide notes? And people were given fake suicide notes. They were told they were real ones and asked whether they could distinguish them or not. And some people said they could, some people said they couldn't. And the experimenters gave them false scores. They told some people they were really good at it and some people they weren't at all good at it. And even if they then debriefed them at the end of the experiment, it turned out that the belief that you're good at it stuck, or the belief that you're not good at it stuck. So people couldn't be debriefed. Once the lie had been fixed, it infected how they thought about themselves and how they thought about other people. And that kind of example suggests that it's very dangerous to deceive people in the course of an experiment, because you can't just undo it. Beliefs are very sticky. We're very unlikely to get rid of a belief entirely. And if you've once been told that you're bad at something, you believe you're bad at it, and if you've once been told you're good at something, you believe that you're good at it. It takes an awful lot to undo that. So there were manipulative and deceptive experiments, which were, I think, quite dangerous in their design. And the ethics commissions have been, I think, quite good at weeding those out, at not allowing those. Of course, in the physical sciences, I don't think you get so many, but in medicine, you certainly got them. I mean, the notorious Tuskegee, is it, experiment? When largely black people were infected with syphilis just to see how it went. But they weren't told that they were being infected with syphilis. And things like that. I think people received more radiation in various experiments than they were told they were getting, and so forth. So I think that treating people as mere means and not as rational agents in their own right is one of the main things that ethics committees try to fend off. Of course, there's sheer cruelty in a way. I mean, vivisection.
Yeah, how about animals?
Yes, exactly. I think it's very, very difficult to get licenses for doing vivisection experiments without adequate anesthetics and so on, and even in the case of quite low animals. And I hope that's true.
Other comment? Yes.
So in the course of your lecture, you put forward different definitions of feelings. First, you talk about biological feelings, the sort of feelings of distress that I might feel if I see someone stomping at my baby and hearing his skull crack. That's one. Then you talk about intuition. If I give an argument to someone and then I have a feeling whether this is good or bad. Then you talk about taste. I like something. I want everyone to like this feeling of taste. I also saw aesthetical feeling, the one that a critic has. So I was wondering, if we are talking about truth theory, is there a true definition of feeling? Or are we lost in the ambiguity of language? And if there is, then what can we say about this true definition of feeling?
Yes, I think the best account of feeling that I know in the philosophical literature was given by Bolzano, And he talked about the way in which a feeling is a state which its function is to incubate an action. He actually uses that word, to incubate. You know, it's the process by which a bird turns an egg into a chicken. You incubate it. And he thought that a feeling was there. It as it were, was an embryonic thing. It was something which could engender a motivation, a hope. If it's a distress, then it engenders a hope for alleviation, a hope for something better. If it's a pleasurable feeling, it engenders a hope for continuation. Pleasurable feelings are ones that you would like to continue. So a feeling, he thought you should define it functionally in terms of what it's for incubating. And it's for incubating a hope, and a hope is a sort of incipient action. If you hope for something, you're on the road to doing something about it. So if you're feeling pleasure at the way your golf is going, then you hope to play more golf, and that as incubates a motive for, you know, paying your fees to the golf club or buying a new set of clubs or practicing more or whatever. If you are distressed by the way your golf is going, then you might hope to play less golf, and that incubates motivation to give up your subscription to the golf club, sell your clubs, turn to tennis or whatever. So, so I think what's good about Bolzano's definition is it gives you a, in a sense, an operational definition. It tells you what to look out for. And it also, of course, tells you, it gives you a criterion for sincerity of feeling. One of the difficulties in knowing our own feelings is we may say things and then not be sure that actually we're representing our own feelings to ourselves properly. We're not sincere, even with ourselves. We lie to ourselves about our feelings about things. So a lot of people lie to themselves. For example, they say they really like Christmas. Nobody likes Christmas. It's horrible. Believe me. But the test for whether you're sincere in saying that you like Christmas is, you know, how wide is your grin as you feel motivated to go out and buy presents and spend money and things. And most people go around the Christmas streets with a face a yard long, as William James said, as Henry James said. So, so I think a nice thing about Bolzano's definition is it gives you at least a beginning into an operational strategy for telling whether your feelings are sincere about things, and it gives you a behavioral kind of manifestation of feeling which you can seize hold of. I think that's the best I know in the philosophical literature. Ryle's paper that I quoted from is very good, but he talks mainly about feelings like feeling that there's a flaw in your argument, which is, I think, slightly different. It's not, it's nearer to being a thought than anything else, whereas the feelings I'm interested in are feelings which are genuine feelings. Okay? That's the best I can do, I think.
Okay, we have another question from the back here.
Hello.
So, thank you very much for your talk. First, if I understood it right, so the take-home message will be that truth will be about good practices and being a good epistemic position and skilled observation. You said things like that all these 3 days, and I have a problem with that because seems like we don't have anymore the what makes something true question, but now I have a different question, is what makes something a good practice or a skilled observation or a good epistemic position? What is the criteria for this? If it's mere intersubjective agreement or something like that, then we are pushed back to the coherence position.
Yeah, good.
If there is some objective criteria, then it's back to correspondence. So.
Good, very good question. I mean, the answer that if I had a fourth lecture, the answer I'd go on to give would be to cite pragmatism. Pragmatism's answer to this was that the advantage, I mean, and what tells you whether somebody's doing his inquiry properly, what tells you whether somebody's worth listening to on something, and so on, is eventually that things go better. It doesn't mean that truth is the same thing as utility at all, but it does mean that in general, the nearer you are to the truth, the better your things work. So the criterion that we haven't talked about, but I would like to talk about, is increased practical utility. I mean, that's obviously in play when we look back at the problems with the philosophy of science that I started with in the first lecture, where, you know, the working scientist is very apt to use the argument, look, you know, how come our rockets land on the moon unless we've got something right about, say, dynamics? How come that our generators generate the amount of electricity we expected unless we've got something right about electrodynamics? How come? And there's always the, look, science is giving us, you know, iPhones. It's giving us GPSs. It's giving us the power grid. It's giving us all sorts of excellent things. How come that you can accept those things and yet deny that science is getting nearer the truth, or is at least on the road to truth, and that the inquirers are doing something right? So there you've got a fairly direct appeal to the practical utility that comes out of it. And of course, you know, if you ask questions like, does medicine progress? Are doctors getting nearer to discovering the causes of diseases and things? Well, the criterion is going to be, can they cure them? Are the results of hospitals now better than the results you get from hospitals 50 years ago? And if it turns out that they're not, then we might start to worry and say that although medicine is progressing in some respects, maybe it's going backwards in others, and so on. So the criterion of practical utility is always going to be there. It's going to have a role to play. And of course that was the role that was insisted on by writers like Peirce, James, Dewey, and so on, right through to the present. Even deflationists are going to give their own account of that. They're going to say that you're going to do better in your practice if you say that objects attract each other with a force proportional to the square of the distance between them. You're going to do better if you say that if objects do attract each other with a force proportional to the inverse square of the distance between them. That's the deflationist version of that, and it can be used to emphasize the practical utility as the virtue and the merit that accrues if you get things right. So I think that's going to be a large part of the subsequent story. No, it wouldn't be a subjective, a purely personal benefit. It would be a social benefit. Ethical judgments are things that we communicate with each other. And so the question is whether we, as a society, as a communicating whole, would do better if we had a good morality than if we had a bad one. And you only have to look at places where bad moralities are in the ascendant to give the answer. Why do refugees come from Africa to Europe and not go the other way around? Because Europe has learned the virtues of social cooperation, of peaceable cooperation, of democratic discussion rather than force, and large tracts of Africa have not. It's as simple as that.
You can continue this discussion later after. Bilateral. Anybody else?
There's one, oh, okay.
My colleague from physics mentioned yesterday already that truth is not really an issue in mathematics. But there's one aspect I was wondering about. So, for example, when you say that 1 + 1 is 2, I guess everybody here who is not a mathematician would immediately agree.
Yes.
But mathematicians could say, well, it depends where.
Ah.
There are other settings where 1 + 1 is 0. So the statement is true in some abstract settings, but in others not. And I was wondering, is there also such a notion in philosophy, truth relative to something, for example, relative to the architecture of the brain? I could imagine there are people who associate colors with sounds. Yes. So if they would say, this sound is red, they could say it's true, but maybe somebody else who doesn't have this physiological feature couldn't agree.
Yes, it's very difficult to know what to do with people who have sort of an odd wiring in that sort of way. Personally, I mean, it's not that I want to say that red isn't the colour of trumpets or whatever it is. It's just that I don't know what to make of the judgment at all. I can't absorb that into my own belief set and do anything with it. If somebody can, well, I'm kind of envious. I don't feel in opposition to them. And I think it's probably the same. I'm not quite sure what kind of context you've got in mind for 1 + 1 not being 2. Are you thinking of things like, well, I mean, supposing you count, supposing you count degrees around the compass, then 350 + 20 is 10. Because you go around through north and you start 10 degrees east again. I mean, that sort of thing. So you get a scale where plus doesn't mean numerical plus in the sense of you're simply adding a set with a certain number to a certain other number and you're getting more. So it's not like adding 350 oranges to 20 oranges, in which case you'd certainly get 370 oranges. It's adding degrees until you get to 360 and then you start again if you're going on round the clock. So you get 350 + 20 is 10. I mean, is that the kind of shift of context you've got in mind? Yeah. I think that you'd probably cope with that just by disambiguating. You're saying that plus has got a slightly different meaning when you're talking about compass bearings than it does when you're talking about adding oranges. That is, you're talking about going 20 degrees further clockwise, and that takes you past 0 and you start again. Whereas you're not talking about anything like that when you talk about adding 20 oranges to 350 oranges. So I think that my own feeling about that kind of example would be that if you were worried about it, you'd specify the context more clearly and you'd disambiguate which function you're actually computing. And if you do that, then of course when people say 1 + 1 = 2, they've got in mind 1 finger plus 1 finger is 2 fingers. It's a simple increase in cardinality of the set. And if you've got some other function in mind, then I think one needs to specify it. But certainly philosophers are keen on disambiguating language wherever it's ambiguous, whenever we spot it. We may not always spot it, but we like to try.
Okay, we have one more question from the back.
Professor Blackburn, thank you for the lecture.
Okay.
My question has two parts. First one, can you please, you presented us with 3 schools of thought you find most important, and you somehow skate over the 4th one. You suggest there's a 4th one, I'm not going to talk about it. So could you go back and maybe explain why?
Right.
And the second part of the question, or what kind of a school of thought this is, and why you find it not so important. And the second part of the question, if this fourth school of thought is phenomenology, or if it's not phenomenology, could you please somehow relate these three schools of thought you talk about to the ideas of Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, who are somehow obsessed by the ideas of sensations and feelings, and had somewhat different take on what rather, let's say, logocentric, these three previous schools, which to me seemed rather logocentric, how they work.
Gosh, the fourth school was one that didn't accept More's argument. More argued that when you make a judgment of value, you're going beyond describing the natural facts. Even if the natural facts give you your standard for applying the value, there's nevertheless a gap between the standard and the verdict. And that I think struck many philosophers as just a matter of logic. It's rather like saying there's a logical difference between, in a court of law, the evidence, that's one thing, the verdict, that's something else. The verdict is given in the light of the evidence, you hope, but the gap between the evidence and the verdict may be more or less large. And in any case, until the judge gives the verdict, there is no verdict. And people thought that More had pointed out some sort of equivalent thing in the case of valuation. You can describe the facts. You know, John stamped on this blind baby for fun. There's the fact. But then the question of whether you're horrified or not is another question. Now, we hope that all decent people are horrified, and then that's the same thing as having a moral verdict. So that's a way of putting More's argument. It's resisted by people in the trade they're called naturalists. It's nothing much to do with phenomenology. Naturalism just said that More had got semantic theory wrong. He got the theory of meaning wrong, because there can be a gap which is, as it were, closable by logic or reasoning, but it isn't obvious, because the train of logic or the train of reasoning can itself be unobvious. And if the gap can be only closed by unobvious reasoning, then it's not surprising that the verdict remains open, even if logically it's actually been closed by the evidence. So, for example, take something unobvious in mathematics. Take, say, Pythagoras' theorem, that the square on the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides of a right-angled triangle. You know, you don't just see that straight off, unless you're Euler or somebody. It needs quite a sophisticated proof, and you might look at the proof and not follow it, or you might look at the proof and think you do follow it, but be worried in case there's a hidden flaw somewhere, and so on. So getting to the fact that if you've got a right-angled triangle with the side of 3 and a side of 4, then the hypotenuse is going to be 5, that might strike people as very unobvious, and it might seem like a new fact about the triangle. But it can be shown that it's implicit in the premises, in what you've already got, that one side is 3 and one side is 4. So people argued that More, by saying that it's possible to doubt, he thought that showed that there was a logical gap between as it were, the evidence and the verdict. But naturalists said, no, it doesn't show that. Maybe there's just a logical connection between certain kinds of description of natural affairs and moral verdicts. Maybe one of them is, you know, if John's stamping on blind babies for fun, John is doing something wrong. Perhaps an unobvious logical connection exists between the one and the other. So that was the pitch of naturalists. It's not been a popular view. It got a certain amount of traction about 30 years ago, because a number of philosophers started making moves about the notion of a property of a thing. a very distinguished philosopher called Saul Kripke and another one called Hilary Putnam, argued that properties might be identical, although it wasn't at all obvious that they were identical. And they took natural kinds as examples. So the natural kind being water is actually identical with the natural kind being H2O. Well, it's slightly more complicated than that actually because of isotopes and things, but roughly water is H2O. So the property of being water is just the same as the property of being H2O. But of course that's not a logical truth, it's a sort of, in this case a scientific truth, it's truth about the constitution of water. And they said, well, maybe that's a model for naturalists to follow, that the constitution of the property of being good was that of something like the property of being conducive to social harmony or increasing happiness of people or something like that. And that was an identity which could be uncovered by some kind of inquiry parallel to chemistry. So there have been various attempts to fight back on behalf of naturalism. And that was the fourth estate, that was the fourth kind of theory that I wasn't going to talk about. Now you've made me talk about it. As for what it's got to do with phenomenology, I'm not the person to ask. I know some of the things that Merleau-Ponty said about the body, I know some of the things that Heidegger said about practice, but I can't relate them to this discussion very easily.
Okay, so that gets us to close the session of questions. But before we come to an end, Professor Stepanians wants to have a word with you.
Yes. Simon, thank you very much for these wonderful lectures. So we have here a little thing for you. It's just for you to also have some memories of your stay in Bern. And well, I enjoyed it very much, and I'm sure we all enjoyed it very much. So one last time, thank you very much.
Okay, so Professor, we hope you keep us in good memory. We certainly will of you. And let me remind you, 1 year ahead, we have another Einstein Lectures on physics, so be prepared. Thank you.